What if the love story that changed everything began with one carefully rehearsed lie? And what if pretending to be in love was the only time you actually felt seen? Elena Moore was never supposed to be anything more than his assistant, organized, efficient, invisible in the background. But when billionaire Julian Whitmore needed anyone to pose as his partner for a weekend of family scrutiny, he didn't choose a model or a socialite. He chose her. Just a favor. He said, just a weekend. But what happens when lines blur between performance and truth, when a woman used to staying in the shadows becomes the reason a man finally steps into the light? And what happens when an old wound walks into the room, threatening to expose everything before either of them is ready to admit what this is? Is it still a lie if your heart believes it? And when the pretending ends, do they have the courage to choose what's real? If you believe in slow burn connection, in love that sneaks in through quiet moments and unspoken truths, then this is the story for you. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where we tell love stories that feel as real as your own. Now, let's begin with a proposition, a lie, and the weekend that changed everything. The sky above Chicago was melting into gold as evening settled over the city. On the 34th floor of Whitmore & Co., one of the Midwest's most prestigious financial firms, Julian Whitmore was still hunched over quarterly projections, his sharp eyes scanning columns of numbers with surgical focus. Behind him, the skyline glimmered like a promise, but Julian never paused to admire it. His life was built on logic, precision, and control. Everything that didn't serve a clear purpose was eliminated. At 38, Julian had expanded his late father's firm into a national powerhouse, efficient, respected, unshakable, and entirely alone. A call from his mother broke the silence. Margot Whitmore, with her signature blend of grace and steel, didn't even say hello before launching into her usual reminder. You haven't forgotten, have you? The anniversary this Saturday. 40 years. Your father would want you there. Julian closed his eyes briefly. He hadn't forgotten. He just hadn't planned to go. And Julian, she added after a beat, don't tell me you're coming solo again. Click. She never waited for a response. The message was clear. Don't show up empty-handed. The next morning, over bitter espresso in the staff lounge, he mentioned the call to his sister Natalie, a blunt, brilliant corporate lawyer with zero patience for emotional nuance. Bring someone, she said flatly. Doesn't need to be real. Just believable. You're a problem solver. Solve it. The idea should have sounded absurd, but it stuck. Later that day, during a team briefing, Elena Moore walked in, a folder in her arms, her stride calm, exact. She had been his executive assistant for nearly 5 years, discreet, unflappable, loyal, and, perhaps, the most stable presence in a world of shifting priorities and endless pressure. Julian watched her for a moment longer than usual. He didn't decide. He calculated. When the meeting ended, he asked her to stay. With the door closed and only silence between them, he folded his hands, leaned forward, and said, I need a favor, not personal. Just logistical. Elena raised an eyebrow. I need someone to accompany me to a family event this weekend, in Lake Forest. You'd be posing as my partner. She blinked. You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend? He nodded once, without flinching. Just for the weekend. I trust you. You understand my schedule, and you can navigate my family better than anyone else here. Elena stared at him, caught between disbelief and something else. He wasn't joking. That much was clear, and that somehow made it harder to say no. That night, in the quiet of her apartment above a corner bookstore, Elena sat staring at her untouched dinner, wondering how exactly she had ended up here, caught between professionalism and the most unexpected proposition of her career. That night, in the small apartment Elena shared with her younger brother, she tried to make sense of everything. Lucas, a second-year engineering student, had recently lost his scholarship after a complicated surgery sidelined him for nearly a semester. The medical bills had snowballed, tuition deadlines loomed, and no matter how hard Elena worked late nights, early mornings, it just wasn't enough. Julian's offer, once absurd, now sounded like a lifeline. Generous pay, 2 weeks off, a weekend of pretending. Uncomfortable, absolutely, but maybe necessary. The next morning, she entered Julian's office with the same calm precision she used when organizing his international calendar, but this time, her voice was firm. "I'll do it," she said, "but under conditions." She laid them out, one by one. No physical contact without explicit consent, absolute confidentiality, and half the payment up front. Julian listened, unreadable as always, but when she finished, a quiet breath escaped him, a rare softness crossing his face. "Deal," he said simply. By Friday afternoon, they were in a sleek black sedan, bound for the Whitmore family estate, just outside Lake Forest. Elena stared out the window as tree-lined roads gave way to long stone walls and manicured drives. She tried to keep her posture composed, her breathing steady. But nothing about this felt routine. Julian, surprisingly, seemed at ease, more so than in the office. He spoke about his grandfather, a stern man who had taught him never to flinch in discomfort, about his older brother, now living abroad, about growing up in a world where control was currency. In return, Elena shared fragments of her past, her mother, a pianist, taken too soon, the burden of raising her brother, the weight of staying afloat, always. Between them, something shifted unspoken, fragile. They spent part of the drive crafting a fictional story, two longtime colleagues who eventually fell into quiet affection. They had been dating for 8 months, comfortable, steady, safe. Elena took notes, memorized dates. They invented memories where they met, what she ordered on their first fake date, even inside jokes. At one point, Julian looked at her and said quietly, "You probably know me better than anyone." She didn't answer, because that sentence said more about his loneliness than it did about her. The estate gates opened without a sound. The Whitmore home stood regal against the fading sky, an enormous colonial mansion with lavender planters, sculpted hedges, and a kind of cleanliness that looked staged, like something curated, not lived in. Their car rolled to a stop in front of a grand marble staircase. A man in a crisp black suit was already waiting, his white gloves folded neatly. He opened the door without a word. Julian glanced at her, last chance to back out. Elena offered a faint smile. "We're already in too deep." As she stepped onto the pristine gravel, the weight of the weekend ahead settled on her shoulders. From one of the tall windows above, she could feel it. Someone was watching. The door swung open before they had a chance to knock. The curtain was rising, and their performance had just begun. A stately woman descended the steps with the grace of someone who had long mastered every room she entered. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, her pearls immaculate, and her gaze warm on the surface, but razor-sharp beneath landed squarely on Julian. Vivian Whitmore opened her arms and embraced her son with practiced affection. "Finally," she said, then turned to the woman standing beside him. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "And this must be your guest." Without missing a beat, Julian placed a hand lightly at Elena's waist. "Mother, this is Elena Moore, my girlfriend." The word hung there, not tentative, but firm, chosen carefully, delivered deliberately. Vivian extended a hand. Her grip was cool and confident. "Welcome, dear." Elena accepted it with composure. "Thank you. It's lovely to meet you." From that moment, she knew every word, every glance, every movement would be weighed, and likely recorded. They stepped inside. The main hall opened into a grand expanse-arched ceilings, a glittering chandelier suspended above polished oak floors, and a sweeping staircase that curved upward like something out of a period film. Oil portraits lined the walls. Solemn ancestors in stiff collars stared down as if to ask, "Who is she?" at the end of the corridor. Voices drifted from the sitting room, inside. Reginald Whitmore stood tall, his silver hair combed precisely, his presence both elegant and unnerving, the family patriarch. He offered Julian a firm handshake, then turned his gaze to Elena. "Welcome," She smiled lightly, keeping her tone neutral. Thank you. Your home is breathtaking, safe, polished, non-committal. The kind of response you could offer anyone anywhere. Then, in a sudden burst of color and warmth, Julian's sister, Lena, entered the room, blonde, animated, and entirely unfiltered. She pulled Julian into a hug before turning to Elena with a grin. It's about time someone pried him away from spreadsheets. Elena chuckled. It wasn't easy. I believe that. Lena laughed. You deserve a medal. For a moment, Elena let herself exhale until another presence shifted the room's energy. Anderson Whitmore, Julian's older brother, walked in with his wife Vanessa, whose expression was all perfect posture and raised eyebrows. So, Anderson began, how long have you two been together? 8 months, Julian answered smoothly. Elena nodded along, silent but steady. Vanessa tilted her head. Interesting. We've never heard of you. We kept things quiet at first, Elena said gently. We wanted to be sure before introducing family. Anderson sank back into the leather chair, his eyes narrowing. Discretion's not always wisdom. Sometimes it's just camouflage. Julian's tone dropped an octave, still calm, but firmer. Elena values privacy. It's one of the reasons I trust her. Before the moment could stretch any tighter, Vivian reappeared holding a drink. Dinner in 30, she announced, with a smile that was somehow both gracious and commanding. Julian turned to Elena. Come on, I'll show you the room. They climbed the sweeping staircase in silence, every step echoing off marble and old money. At the top, Vivian's voice followed them. I had the guest room next door made ready for Elena, but of course, you may arrange things however you like. Julian didn't hesitate. That won't be necessary. She's staying with me. Elena didn't flinch, but she could feel Vivian's gaze behind them like a second skin. Inside the bedroom, Julian locked the door, leaned against it, and exhaled. First test complete. Elena sat at the edge of the bed. The performance had just begun, and so far, no one had called their bluff. Elena settled into a tufted armchair near the tall window, exhaling slowly. They're more direct than I expected. Julian let out a quiet laugh as he loosened his collar. Old money Chicago. That was them being polite. The room reflected the family's legacy, dark walnut furniture, thick velvet curtains, oil paintings in heavy frames. A king-sized bed sat at the center, flanked by antique nightstands. A deep green leather sofa stretched along one wall near the fireplace. Julian gestured toward the bed. Take it. I'll use the couch. Elena nodded. That's fair. She retreated into the bathroom to change. The running water muffled her thoughts. After a moment's hesitation, she chose a deep burgundy dress, modest in shape, soft in fabric, graceful, but not loud. She pulled back part of her hair, added a touch of lipstick, and took a long breath before stepping out. Julian stood by the mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his dress shirt. When he turned and saw her, he stilled just for a moment. You look beautiful. Elena offered a small nod. Thank you. It was a simple exchange, polite, safe. But there was a pause, fleeting and unspoken, where his gaze lingered just a second too long. She noticed. She didn't comment. She picked up her clutch. Shall we? They descended the staircase together, rehearsed smiles in place, each silently preparing for the second act of their performance, without realizing how easily truth was beginning to blur the edges of fiction. The Whitmore dining hall was as grand as the rest of the estate vaulted ceilings, linen drapes billowing gently, and a polished oak table that stretched the length of the room like a runway for reputation. A golden chandelier shimmered above the crystal place settings. Elena took her seat beside Julian, her spine straight, fingers lightly resting on the stem of her glass. Her eyes subtly scanned the faces around her. Reginald sat at the head, as expected, with Vivian beside him, silent and statuesque. Down at the far end, Anderson and Vanessa maintained a quiet dominance. Their eyes rarely blinked. Their smiles rarely reached their eyes. Only Lena, Julian's sister, seemed relaxed, chatting effortlessly, tossing in light jokes to ease the invisible pressure clinging to the room since their arrival. But even laughter couldn't shift the spotlight. Everyone was watching them, their every word, every glance, every silence. Midway through the first course, Reginald raised his glass not to toast, but to inspect. Julian tells us you've worked together for years. Elena nodded calmly. 3, to be exact. Reginald's brow lifted, tone unreadable. And only now you've become close. Julian stepped in, smoothly. It started with trust, respect, the kind that builds quietly over time. Elena added, her voice firm but composed. We made sure it wouldn't interfere with the professional environment. We only acted when we were certain. It sounded prepared because it was... But there was just enough honesty between their eyes to blur the rehearsed lines. Vivian lifted her glass, but didn't sip. You seem in sync. The pause after those words hung in the air, like a thread waiting to fray. The conversation shifted, to wine, to roses blooming in the East Garden, to guests arriving for the upcoming anniversary gala. But the attention never really left the couple at the center of it all, and beneath the silverware and surface-level smiles, a quiet question pulsed in every glance. Who is she really, and what does she want? The next day unfolded slowly, sunlight pouring into the Whitmore estate like liquid gold. Conversations turned lighter, more social. At brunch, Lena shared a story from a recent charity gala, filled with laughter and anecdotes, but it didn't take long for Vanessa to steer the conversation back to the couple of the hour. So, Lena asked playfully, what was your first official date like? Elena smiled, already prepared. They'd crafted this story together during the drive. Dinner near the lake, cozy little Italian place, the kind with candles and too much wine, Julian added with a soft laugh. She made me laugh so hard, I nearly spilled my drink. I can't remember the last time that happened. The tone was easy, natural. The smiles around the table softened, at least for the moment, but tension had a way of circling back. Anderson leaned forward. And at work, how do you manage boundaries? It's a high-pressure environment. Elena's posture straightened. Clear separation, no overlap, no influence on decisions. We operate exactly as we did before. Julian nodded. She's the most competent person I've ever worked with. Our relationship doesn't change that. Vanessa tapped her spoon gently against her glass. Still, workplace romances rarely end well. Just being honest. Elena kept her tone calm but firm. We're not a typical couple. That makes all the difference. Her delivery was measured, steady, the way someone speaks when they've been underestimated before. Across the table, Lena hid a smile behind her wine glass. Reginald hadn't said a word, but his eyes never left Elena measuring, noting, as if calculating risks on a balance sheet. As dessert plates were cleared, Julian surprised her. He began sharing details about her things she didn't realize he noticed. She always orders black coffee but never finishes it, taps her pen twice before she signs anything. And don't even think about rearranging her desk drawer, she'll know. Elena glanced at him, caught off guard. You pay attention. Hard not to. For a moment, everything paused, not with tension, but something softer. Lena sighed dramatically. You know what this looks like? A married couple in denial? Laughter followed light and unexpected. Even Reginald allowed himself a small smile. Vanessa simply sipped her drink, silent. Vivian finished her wine, her expression unreadable. The lightness lasted only moments. Later, as talk shifted to the following evening's celebration, Reginald addressed the room without looking directly at Elena. Tomorrow will be significant. I trust everyone will rise to the occasion. It sounded less like encouragement and more like a challenge. That evening, the family moved to the lounge, dim lighting, quiet jazz, a fire crackling gently. Julian and Elena walked together toward the couches when Anderson stepped into their path. Convincing story, he said, but even the best ones crack under pressure. Elena met his gaze head on. Then we'll be ready. Anderson didn't reply. He nodded slightly, then turned away. Elena sat beside Julian, her eyes wandering across the room, the leather-bound books, the glint of old glassware, the glances subtle, layered. She was no longer just a woman playing a role in someone else's life. She was being studied, tested, and maybe seen. Morning came with pale light seeping through heavy curtains. Elena sat up slowly, tension still coiled in her shoulders. Julian was gone, and somehow, that absence felt heavier than she expected. The leather couch on the far side of the room looked undisturbed. Not a crease, not a pillow out of place. Elena blinked, unsure if Julian had even laid down at all. Maybe he'd woken before dawn, or maybe he was simply the kind of man who vanished into the quiet before the world caught up. She wrapped a light cardigan over her nightgown and opened the balcony door. Outside, the garden glistened beneath the morning sun. Dew shimmered on every blade of grass, and the towering trees of Lake Forest filtered golden light onto the stone terrace below. Julian sat there, alone, coffee in hand, tablet on his lap, back straight, but eyes softer than usual. He noticed her in the doorway and gave a small smile. "There's coffee. I got you some." She joined him, accepting the cup, grateful for the warmth against the chill in the air. They sat in silence for a while, filling the space with small, harmless observations. The scent of cedar, the guest itinerary, the unusual color of the wood stain on the deck. Safe topics, the kind that lived between trust and hesitation. Then Elena spoke, her voice low. "You seem different here." Julian looked toward the trees. "Here, I'm not negotiating contracts or watching stock tickers. I'm just breathing." She studied his expression. There was no suit of armor today, just a man in a sweater with too much on his mind. "Have you ever thought about walking away?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. The pause was long, honest. "Yes," he finally said, "but I wouldn't know how. This life, it's all I've ever known." She nodded, no judgment, just understanding. It was a rare moment Julian Whitmore, usually calculated to the second, now admitting there were corners of his life even he hadn't mapped. A soft knock broke the silence. Vivian appeared, already dressed for the day, her shawl draped perfectly, not a hair out of place. "We're going for a short walk. Reginald wants to show the vineyard paths." Julian nodded. "We'll join you." Once she left, he turned to Elena. "She's watching, always. She'll build an entire narrative from the way we stand or the space between us." Elena finished her coffee, unfazed. She already has a story in her head. She's just waiting for the ending she wants. The walk, surprisingly, was pleasant. Reginald took the lead, playing the role of proud storyteller, sharing tales from decades past, as though he were guiding a museum tour of his own life. Julian stayed beside Elena the entire time, quietly attentive. When the path grew uneven, he offered his arm. When the group scattered to admire a grove of hydrangeas, he led her down a side trail. It opened into a clearing, shaded by a massive oak. At its base sat an old wooden bench, weathered but strong. Julian pointed to the tree trunk. "My father started this tradition when he married my mother. Every year, he comes back here and carves a heart with their initials." Elena stepped closer, running her fingers over the rough bark. Dozens of hearts, some fresh, some faded into time. "They still do it." He nodded. "Tonight will be the 41st. She traced one of the carvings, quietly. "And do you believe in that kind of love?" The air held the question between them. Julian exhaled, not quite answering. "I used to think it was a bit much. But it's hard not to rethink things when you see something that lasts 4 decades. Elena kept her eyes on the old oak trunk. "You speak about them with such respect, even though you seem nothing like them." Julian gave a soft laugh, low and honest. Maybe that's exactly why. As they made their way back toward the house, Elena walked in silence, caught between the story they had rehearsed and the reality slowly forming between them. What began as structured fiction now felt less defined. The glances, the pauses, the little gestures, they weren't part of the plan anymore. They were something else, something real. Julian, once a fortress of logic and distance at the office, now showed her cracks, memories, uncertainties, softness she'd never expected. Halfway up the stairs, Lena appeared in the hallway and gently stopped Elena with a hand on her arm. Want some advice? Elena nodded. Don't underestimate my mother. She plays polite better than anyone I've ever met, but nothing gets past her. Not one word, not one inconsistency. Her voice lowered. If you want to survive this, stay consistent, all the time. Elena thanked her, then continued in silence. She didn't need to ask what survive meant. She already knew. By lunch, Julian was waiting in the foyer, posture relaxed, hands tucked casually into his pockets. The tension from the previous night had softened into something quieter, something like trust. When Elena appeared, he stepped forward and gently adjusted her necklace. It was a little off, he said simply. It was an ordinary act, barely a moment, but intimate, automatic. Vivian, passing by in an elegant shawl, paused just long enough to make it clear she noticed. Elena's breath hitched. That wasn't rehearsed. But somehow, it said more than any line they'd practiced. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in soft crescendo. Musicians rehearsed in corners. Staff moved swiftly, aligning candles, checking lighting, straightening every napkin. The grand ballroom filled with warm hues of cream and moss. Rows of chairs were placed with near-military precision. The celebration would be more than a tribute to 40 years of marriage. It would be a stage, a test. And Elena knew she would be in the spotlight, whether she liked it or not. Upstairs, in the bedroom's soft lamplight, Elena stood before a full-length mirror. She wore a flowing black gown with a gentle neckline, elegant, timeless. Her hair fell in soft waves, and the pearl necklace Lena had lent her rested delicately at her collarbone. She applied a muted rose lipstick, took a breath, then another. She wasn't sure where Elena Moore ended and where the woman in the mirror began. A knock at the door. Julian entered, dressed in a charcoal suit, burgundy tie, hair styled to perfection. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, simply, "You look stunning." She met his gaze, smiled gently, and whispered back, "Thank you." He offered his arm. Ready. She paused, just long enough to feel the shift, then took it. They descended the grand staircase together. Each step echoed louder, each glance from below sharper. Vivian stood waiting in a silver gown, her poise absolute, her smile as perfectly measured as everything else in the room. As they reached the final marble step, Vivian moved toward them, smiling. But behind that smile was calculation. "You two look radiant." Vivian's smile was graceful, calculated. "The guests will adore you." And just like that, the introductions began. Elena found herself moving from one handshake to another. Old friends of the Whitmores, corporate allies, distant cousins with familiar last names and unreadable eyes. Julian's hand never left her waist. He guided her with ease, leaning in occasionally with a soft remark meant only for her. "That one owns half the West Loop. Avoid the woman in green, she collects secrets like souvenirs." Elena smiled, nodded, replied with poise. But beneath the surface, she could feel the layers of the performance stretching thinner by the minute. Then came the remark. A woman in pearls glanced at her neck. "Isn't that Vivian's necklace? I'm quite sure she wore it to her engagement dinner." Elena answered with quiet grace. "Yes. She suggested I wear it," Julian added smoothly. "We thought it was a meaningful gesture." Vivian, standing nearby, didn't object. She simply sipped her champagne and watched. Soon after, Reginald stepped onto a small platform, microphone in hand. The lighting cast a golden glow across the room as his voice filled the space, measured, resonant, commanding. 40 years of marriage isn't built on perfection. It's built on daily choice, on staying, when walking away might be easier. Silence followed, respectful, listening. "Tonight, we don't just mark a journey, we honor what it built and what we hope our children will one day find for themselves." His gaze moved across the ballroom landing, for just a moment, on Julian, then Elena, even for those whose partnerships are newly unveiled. Laughter rippled lightly through the room. Julian didn't react. but Elena caught the subtle clench of his jaw. Then the music began. Couples drifted toward the dance floor. Eleanor and Reginald led the waltz, gliding with the practiced rhythm of a bond well-worn and well-kept. Elena watched from the edge of the room until Julian appeared. "Care to dance?" She raised a brow. "You know how, since I was 12, he replied with a smile. She placed her hand in his. They moved to the center, and as the music rose, so did the attention of the entire room. Julian moved with quiet precision, each step confident, each touch deliberate. Elena matched him easily, but her focus slipped from the rhythm drawn instead to his eyes. There, in the swirl of candlelight and cello, there was no script, no audience, just them. When the final note faded, they were closer than choreography required. "Breathless," she whispered. "Everyone's watching." He leaned in. "I know." His forehead nearly brushed hers, then interrupted. A waiter passed with a silver tray. Elena stepped back, took a glass, and retreated to the edge of the room. Her heart didn't retreat with her. Julian stood there for a beat, then turned to greet another couple. Alone for a moment. Elena tried to steady herself. It was supposed to be a performance, she reminded herself. Just a weekend, but every look, every word, every unplanned gesture was pulling her further from the script. And she was beginning to wonder, could she still find her way back? The evening unfolded with elegance music from a string quartet, soft clinks of porcelain, the scent of roses and espresso in the air. But across the room, as she stood beneath the chandelier's glow, Elena didn't feel like an assistant anymore. She felt like something else entirely, something that terrified her far more than the lies ever had. Near the grand windows, her champagne barely touched, Elena stood quietly, watching Julian across the room. He was speaking with two older gentlemen by the fireplace, his expression animated, confident. But she barely heard the conversation, because whatever this weekend had started as, it wasn't that anymore. The lines had blurred, the performance had changed, and before she could gather her thoughts, a shift at the entrance drew her eye. A man entered tailored suit, effortless posture, and a smile that knew exactly where it belonged. Her breath caught. Heath Caldwell. There was no mistaking him. That crooked grin, that sharp, calculating gaze, the kind of presence that made everyone look twice and not always for the right reasons. Elena's hands tensed. The very chapter of her past she'd tried to leave sealed had just walked into the Whitmore estate. He saw her almost instantly, and his smile widened, not warm, not cruel, just knowing, like he still owned a piece of the past she'd tried to forget. Julian, catching the subtle change in her expression, followed her gaze. As Heath approached, his voice came smooth, casual. "Elena Moore." Now, this is a surprise. She forced composure into her tone. "Heath, what are you doing here?" He gave a nonchalant glance around. "Friend of Julian's cousin invited me. Didn't expect to find such charming company in attendance." His gaze flicked to Julian. "You must be Julian Whitmore. I've heard quite a bit." Julian extended a hand without flinching. "And you are Heath Caldwell. Elena and I used to work together." His tone was friendly, too friendly, the kind that wrapped danger in politeness. Elena crossed her arms lightly. It was brief. He chuckled. "Perspective is everything. Isn't it game on?" Julian kept a calm exterior. Pleasure. Elena was always intense, committed, good to see her doing well. The air around them tightened. A few guests nearby started glancing over. Julian offered a firm nod. "If you'll excuse us, we should circulate." Heath smiled. Of course, just couldn't miss saying hello to an old friend. And with that, he disappeared into the crowd. Elena exhaled. Finally, Julian looked at her. "Ex." She nodded. "We worked together, dated, briefly. It ended badly." Julian stepped closer, lowered his voice. "Want to leave?" She shook her head. "No, I won't let him ruin this." They returned to the ballroom, but something had shifted. The curiosity in the room had evolved into calculation, speculation. Vivian saw it. She intercepted them in the hallway, her voice pleasant, but her eyes sharp. That gentleman, he seemed to know you well. Everything all right, Elena? Elena straightened her spine. We had a history. I didn't know he'd be here. Vivian tilted her head. I see. Just keep your focus. Tonight matters to all of us. Then she walked on, not waiting for a reply. Later, Julian led Elena through a side corridor. The east wing was quiet, dimly lit. She leaned back against the wood-paneled wall, closing her eyes. Do you think anyone will figure it out? Julian stood beside her, his voice low. I think Heath came here with a plan. She sighed. You don't know what he's capable of. When we ended things, he twisted everything, manipulated people. It nearly cost me my job, my reputation. She trailed off, the past pressing too close, and neither of them realized. Heath hadn't left the ballroom. He was watching, and he was just getting started. He twisted everything, Elena said softly. Told stories at the office. I had to leave. Start over. Julian studied her. Really studied her for the first time. Perhaps not as his assistant, not as his pretend partner, but as someone who had survived something messy and real. You never told me. She shrugged lightly. Because it doesn't define me. No, he said, stepping closer. But it explains why you keep your distance. Their eyes met. I'm not great at closeness, she admitted. That's why our arrangement felt safer. Julian didn't look away. Does it still feel that way? Elena didn't answer. She didn't need to. He reached for her hand, not in performance, not in front of anyone. They were alone. No audience, no expectations. His hand was warm, solid, no pressure, just presence. She didn't pull away. Their fingers stayed locked. Are you still playing a role? Julian. He shook his head slowly. I haven't been, for a while. Elena exhaled, deeply, like releasing something she didn't even realize she'd been holding. Me neither. What followed wasn't dramatic. No kiss, no declaration, no sudden decision. Just two people, finally still, close enough to feel the truth forming, but not quite ready to step past the line. The air inside the estate had shifted, not with announcement or scandal, but with looks. The way conversations stopped mid-sentence when Elena or Julian passed. The new tone when their names were whispered over coffee or champagne. Heath hadn't caused a scene. He didn't have to. His presence had planted seeds, questions, doubts, tension. The next morning, brunch was served in the garden. White linens, silver teapots. Sunshine filtered through the trellis overhead. Elena stepped into the space and immediately sensed it. Polite smiles, lingering handshakes, eyes that didn't quite settle. Lena tried to ease the air, pulling her aside to chat about floral arrangements, but even that didn't last long. Did Heath say something I should know? Lena asked, lowering her voice. Elena looked her straight in the eye. He did what he always does. Stirred the pot, left others to doubt. Across the garden, Julian was standing with Reginald and Vivian. He was calm, but she could see the tightness in his shoulders. He felt it too. When their eyes met, they exchanged the smallest nod, a silent pact. They were about to walk into the next round. Minutes later, Vivian asked them to join her in the library. The room smelled like cedar and ink. Books lined the walls, leather-bound, immaculate. Reginald was already seated. Anderson joined moments after. It felt less like a conversation, and more like a board meeting. Vivian didn't bother with pretense. We believe it's time for some clarity. Elena stood, hands folded, calm, ready. Julian spoke first. If this is about Heath, he's part of her past. And that past has nothing to do with any of you. Anderson cut in. It's not about the ex. It's about the fact that he told us more about your relationship than either of you have. A flush rose in Elena's cheeks, but she kept her posture. We didn't realize we needed approval. Vivian crossed her legs slowly. It's not approval we want. It's transparency. her gaze fixed on Elena. Anyone stepping into this family, even temporarily, deserves to know what they're stepping into. The words hung in the room like fog. And for the first time, Elena realized this wasn't about trust. It was about control, and she would have to choose, soon, whether to keep playing along or start claiming her own story. Reginald spoke next, his voice even, but edged with weight. "Julian, the issue isn't just her, it's you. You've always kept your life locked behind glass, never introduced anyone, and now, you show up with your assistant as your partner." Julian didn't blink. "Elena has been beside me for years. When the firm faced its darkest quarters, she kept things together. If I have the stability to stand here today, it's because of her." Vivian remained expressionless. "And how long have you been together?" Elena stepped forward. Calm. 8 months. Her voice didn't waver, but the room's air turned heavier. Anderson crossed his arms. "There are inconsistencies, and now, with Heath stirring the waters, it's already creating problems we didn't invite." Julian stood. This was never supposed to unravel like this. "But maybe. It's time to stop pretending." The room stiffened. I asked Elena to pose as my girlfriend, just for the weekend, because I was tired of pretending for you all. He didn't soften it. I didn't want to fake another relationship or face another dinner with sympathetic stares, so I asked the only person I trust. Silence. Anderson exhaled like he'd won. Vivian said nothing. Reginald lowered his eyes, but Julian wasn't finished. "I understand what we did, and I regret pulling the family into something we should have faced directly. That's on me." There was a pause. Then Elena stepped forward. Her voice didn't shake. "I'm sorry, too. Not for saying yes, but for thinking we could script something this complicated. If the family wants clarity, I'm here. But what's between Julian and me, that belongs to us." No one spoke for a moment. Then, finally, Reginald rose. "You've stirred the pot, that's clear. But maybe you're just two adults, trying to make sense of something real. I hope you both know what you're doing." Vivian followed, graceful as always. The party isn't over. And now, more than ever, everyone will be watching. Anderson left last, without a word. As the door closed, Julian turned to Elena. "If you want to leave, I'll understand." She shook her head. "I don't want to go, but I don't want to keep pretending either." Julian drew a long breath. "Then we move forward, as we are." She nodded. They walked out side by side, not conspirators anymore, but two people who'd stopped performing and started telling the truth. That evening, under a crystal sky, the estate still pulsed with quiet conversations and half-empty champagne flutes. Elena and Julian mingled, polite but distant, no longer selling a story. And yet, something hung in the air, as if everything they hadn't said still echoed between them. Later, when the final toasts ended and the elder guests began to depart, Elena excused herself. She climbed the stairs slowly, stripped off her gown, washed her face, tied her hair into a loose knot, now in a simple blouse and cotton pants. She finally let herself breathe. Then a knock. It was Julian. He stepped in quietly and sat by the window, elbows on knees, staring at the floor. He didn't speak right away, and she didn't force him to. Finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we crossed a line we can't come back from." His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of everything they hadn't said. Elena crossed her arms, grounding herself. "I didn't expect this to be simple, but I never thought it would get under my skin like this." Julian looked up slowly. "What happened downstairs? I took responsibility, because it was my idea from the start, but I couldn't explain what's really going on." She stepped closer. "You didn't have to do that. I didn't want to put you under fire," he said, "but I also didn't want to keep pretending that you're just helping me out." Elena sat on the edge of the bed. Her voice was steady. "You still don't know what you want." "Do you?" Julian paused longer than usual. "I know what I don't want. I don't want to go back to how things were. I don't want you leaving this house thinking this was just a polished lie. She looked down. And I don't want to walk away thinking. I got swept into a part that started to feel too real. This silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest, unfiltered. Julian stepped closer. You looked different today, he said. When you stood up to my mother, when you stayed calm while everything cracked. I didn't just see someone I admire. I saw someone who matters, more than I planned for. Elena gave a small, faint smile. You've always been good with words, but that's not enough, is it? He stopped in front of her. What do you need? Her eyes didn't waver. Honesty. No scripts. If this breaks, let it break for the right reasons. And if it stands, we have to know what we're building. Julian extended his hand, quiet but steady. Do you want to try? She reached for it. I want to understand this. No more performances. No more rehearsals. He nodded, firm. No more rehearsals. And in the stillness that followed, there were no more words to add. When he pulled her into an embrace, she felt it. Not certainty, not clarity, but relief. Not an ending, a beginning. Something imperfect, unknown, but real. That night, long after the music faded and the estate grew quiet, they stood side by side on the balcony, looking up at stars they didn't name, speaking only in glances, small comments, the language of peace. There were no promises, no labels, just a shared desire to keep going, one honest step at a time. And for that moment, it was enough. The next morning arrived crisp and quiet. The mansion, still and drowsy, carried a new kind of hush. Elena woke slowly, sunlight warming the sheets beside Julian. There was no longer any confusion about how she felt, but there was still the natural uncertainty about where it all might lead. She wrapped herself in a robe and stepped into the hallway. Down in the private lounge, Julian was already up reading something on his tablet, coffee beside him. He looked up and smiled, gentle, familiar now. Good morning. Elena nodded, voice soft. Morning. He stood, set the device aside. There's coffee in the kitchen. Lena came by earlier, Julian said, setting 2 mugs on the counter. She made sure everything was ready for breakfast. Elena gave him a soft nod of thanks and followed him into the sunlit kitchen. The morning light streamed through tall windows, filling the space with golden warmth. They sat together at the marble island, sipping their coffee slowly. The silence between them had changed, no longer strained. It was the kind of stillness that felt safe, comfortable, like a shared breath between people who finally understood each other. After a while, Julian spoke quietly. If you want to head back to Chicago today, I'll understand. Elena looked at him steadily. Do you want me to go? He shook his head once. I want you to stay, but I also don't want you to feel obligated to something that's still forming. She exhaled gently. We've already crossed the line, Julian. And despite everything, the pressure, the awkwardness, the lies, what's left, I don't want to walk away from it. He held his cup between both hands. Neither do I. By late morning, they walked side by side through the estate gardens. Gone were the music and chatter. Staff were taking down string lights, packing centerpieces into boxes. The party was over. The masks had been set down. Now it was just the aftermath. They stopped beneath the same oak tree from earlier, the one with hearts etched deep into its bark. Elena traced one of the oldest carvings with her fingertips. It doesn't matter how long it's been. What matters is what you build and whether it lasts. Julian looked at her. Are you saying we still could? She turned to face him. I'm saying we're standing at the beginning, and what happens next, that depends on how brave we're willing to be. That afternoon, Lena found them with 2 envelopes in hand. Quick gathering in the East Wing. Just a few foundation supporters and board members. Word's already spread. They want to see you both. Elena's stomach tightened for a moment, but she steadied herself. This wasn't unfamiliar anymore. She knew who she was. Inside the East Wing sitting room, Vivian, Lena, and 2 family advisors were already seated. Vivian didn't waste time. Let's be clear. We all know why we're here. What I want to hear is how you intend to address the consequences. Julian didn't flinch. together. What happened between us is private. We'll manage it with integrity without bringing drama into the company or the family. Elena added calmly, I'm willing to take full responsibility for my choices, but I'd prefer that any personal matters remain personal. Vivian held her gaze, then gave a brief nod. As long as there's honesty and discretion, there's no need for further involvement. No anger, no lectures, just a reminder they would be watched. As they stepped back into the hallway, Elena turned to Julian. Have you ever felt this exposed? He smiled faintly. Never. You not once, she said with a laugh. But maybe that's what we needed to stop running. That night, they returned to the suite balcony. The stars were out. The wind was soft. Julian brewed 2 mugs of tea and handed one to her. They sat close. Her head found his shoulder. When this started, I had no idea where we'd end up, she whispered. He kissed the top of her head gently. Neither did I. But this is exactly where I want to be. And in the hush of that moment, there were no strategies, no performance, no need to explain. Just 2 people learning how to love one another, one quiet evening at a time. The next morning arrived bright and calm. The Whitmore estate returned to its usual rhythm staff, moving with practiced grace, the air crisp with early autumn. Julian and Elena shared breakfast in the sunlit conservatory. No tension, no weight, just 2 people finding comfort in the quiet. They talked softly about returning to Chicago, about the company, about whatever this thing between them was becoming. Elena reached across the table and touched his hand. Let's take it slow, she said, but let's keep moving forward. Julian nodded. I'm not asking for anything more than time, just more of this, more of you, beyond the office, beyond the roles. She smiled gently. Before they left, Lena met them near the front steps. For what it's worth, she said, her voice warm, you two, you make sense. I don't know what the future looks like, but I saw something real. Elena hugged her tightly. Thank you. On the ride back to the city, they sat close in the back seat, fingers intertwined, conversation light, glances lingering. When the car stopped in front of her building, Julian moved to open his door too. May I come up? Elena hesitated just for a second, then nodded. You can, in her apartment. She placed her bag on the couch and moved to the kitchen. Julian watched her quietly, as if seeing something entirely new. She returned with 2 mugs of coffee, handing him one. He set it aside and gently pulled her closer. I've been thinking about how this started. He said, a performance. But somehow, it became the truest thing I've ever known. Elena sat beside him, their knees touching. Then let's treat it that way. Let's protect it. Let it grow. Slowly. Honestly. Julian nodded. We owe that to both of us. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a steady hum. Elena joined Whitmore Capital in a new role leading special projects, with space to define her own path. At the office, things were kept discreet, as promised, but beyond the office walls, something new was unfolding. Late dinners, cups of tea on her balcony, quiet Sunday mornings with Ben, her younger brother, now smiling more often with Julian around. They didn't rush. There were no sweeping declarations, no dramatic milestones, just presence, notes on the kitchen counter, a text in the middle of a busy day, a look across a room that said everything. Lena made sure to invite them often. Vivian, though distant, began to acknowledge Elena's place with a quiet grace that spoke louder than any words. Gradually, Elena became not just part of Julian's life, but a thread woven into the very fabric of it. And when they spent the night together, there was no performance left, just closeness, familiar, safe, real. Her laughter in the morning, his forehead pressed to hers before leaving. The kind of intimacy that didn't need grand gestures, only sincerity, because their love didn't begin in the usual way. It grew in the pauses, in the patience, in the choice to stay day after day. And at the end of each day, when Elena rested her head on Julian's shoulder, there were no roles left to play, no doubts, no echoes of the past, just the present, the one they chose to live together. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes, it begins with a favor, a quiet agreement, a moment of pretending. But what if that pretending opens the door to something real, something honest, something that feels like home? Julian and Elena didn't plan on falling for each other, but maybe that's the kind of love that lasts, the kind that grows in the quiet, in the truth, in the space between two people who finally stop running. So, if you've ever wondered whether love can begin in the most unexpected way, maybe this story gave you an answer. If it touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who still believes in quiet magic, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us. Love doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep believing in the beautiful, unexpected.